Okay, so you know how you send us all those materials about like management and all the stuff that comes with being in a workplace?
Yeah, it was a pretty huge collection of thoughts on, just basically how to navigate the ins and outs of working with other people.
Right. And one of the things that really stood out, at least for me, was this book, One on One with Andy Grove. It's got all these insights from, well, Andy Grove, and he, was the president of Intel, so he's definitely been around the block a few times.
Oh, yeah, for sure. And I mean, he's got decades of experience managing people and building, a massively successful company. So what he has to say about management, that's definitely worth paying attention to.
Absolutely. And one of the things that just like clicked for me reading all this was this idea that, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's basically that everybody's a manager in some way.
Yeah, okay, I see what you're getting at.
Like, think about it. We're always trying to, get things done, but not always just by ourselves. We're working with colleagues, we're leading teams, we're even figuring out how to like best work with our own bosses.
Right, right. So it's like, even if you don't have that formal title of manager, you're still dealing with those same dynamics of influencing people and getting them, moving in the same direction.
Exactly. And what's so cool about Grove's book is that he covers so much ground.
Hmm.
He talks about everything from, working with different personalities, which we all know can be a
But
challenge.
yeah, that's the understatement of the century.
Right. And then there's like the whole promotion process, which can be so
Now,
nerve-wracking.
tell me about it. And then there's, giving feedback in a way that's actually helpful, making decisions when there's like a million factors to consider. It's a lot.
It is, but it's also like super essential stuff to get right. So what we're going to do in this deep dive is, pull out some of the most, I guess, valuable and actionable insights from all the stuff you sent us. We'll focus on the stuff that can help you right now, no matter, what your situation is at work. Sound good?
Sounds good to me.
Awesome. So let's start, I guess, at the beginning. Like, what does it even mean to be a manager? And, what's the value they bring to the table? So, like, from Grove's perspective, what does it actually mean to be well managed?
Well, Grove, he kind of breaks it down in a really practical way. He says being well managed, it basically means having a good boss, like someone who's, knowledgeable and who's actually paying attention to you and what you need to succeed. So that includes things like training, of course, but also like regular coaching to help you improve your skills.
Yeah, because just throwing someone into the deep end without any guidance,
Yeah,
that's a recipe for disaster.
totally. And then there are evaluations too. And not just like, a quick pat on the back or a slap on the wrist. Grove's talking about like real constructive feedback on how you're doing, both the good and the not so good. And he also talks a lot about encouragement. When you hit a roadblock, your manager should be there to help you, get back on track.
Yeah, it's about creating an environment where people feel supported, but also like challenged to grow.
Exactly. And I mean, it sounds pretty basic, right? But you'd be surprised how many managers just, drop the ball on these fundamental
Oh,
things.
I've definitely seen it. So we've got a picture now of what like basic good management looks like. But what about those managers who just they take it to the next level? How do they go beyond the basics to make their teams like seriously high performing?
Right. So Grove talks about this idea of the manager as a force multiplier. It's this idea that a truly great manager, they don't just manage people. They actually make their whole team more effective than, if everyone was just working individually. Ooh, I like that.
Yeah,
It's like they're amplifying everyone's impact.
exactly. So how do they do that? Well, it's a bunch of things, really. They work on improving their team skills, but they also do a really good job of connecting the dots between what each person is doing and the bigger picture. Like, how does your work contribute to the overall goals of the organization?
Right. Because if people don't understand how their work fits in, it's easy to feel like, well, what's the point?
Exactly. And then a great manager, they're also really good at seeing the bigger picture and proactively eliminating unnecessary work. Like, why are we doing things this way if it's not actually helping us achieve our goals?
It's about constantly looking for ways to streamline and improve,
Right.
right?
And they're also good at preventing problems before they even pop up. And
Right.
of course, setting clear objectives. If everyone knows what they're working towards and what success looks like, it's a lot easier to, actually get there. That makes a ton of sense. And the last thing you mentioned, I think, is really important. Creating that environment where everyone feels like their contributions were actually valued.
Yeah.
Like, it's not just about the work itself. It's also about feeling like you're part of something bigger, something that matters.
Absolutely. So yeah, when you put it all together, it's a pretty, comprehensive view of what a truly effective manager does.
Hmm.
But there's one thing Grove talks about, one like really simple way a manager can add value that I think is just so powerful.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that?
It's the idea of the manager as the ultimate problem solver.
Okay, elaborate on that.
So Grove tells this story about how he got into this huge disagreement with one of his colleagues, right? Like a full-blown scientific dispute.
Hmm.
And it got so bad that it was actually like preventing them from getting any work done. They were just, butting heads constantly.
Oof, yeah, I can imagine how that would derail things.
Totally. So their boss, he steps in, right? And he doesn't try to, tell them who's right or wrong or force them to make up or whatever. He looks at the situation and he says, okay, how can we untangle this in a way that lets both of you get back to work? And he ends up reassigning some responsibilities, just kind of shifting things around so that they're not constantly in each other's hair. And it worked.
Wow. So it's not always about having all the answers or, being the smartest person in the room. Sometimes it's just about clearing the path for your team, removing the obstacles so they can actually do what they do best.
Exactly. Sometimes the most valuable thing a manager can do is just step in and untangle a knot that's holding everyone back.
It's like, being that person who fixes the jammed printer. It doesn't sound glamorous, but when it's preventing everyone from working, it's a lifesaver.
Yeah, that's a good analogy. And it highlights something that Grove emphasizes a lot, that a manager's output, it's not just about their own individual work anymore.
Right. It becomes the output of their whole team, their whole organization, really.
Exactly. It's a huge shift in mindset. It's not about, how many reports you write or how many presentations you give. It's about how effectively your team is performing and how that contributes to the overall success of the company.
That is a huge shift.
Ah.
Okay, so we've talked about the core of what a manager does, how they add value and all that, but let's get into some of the, I guess, trickier aspects of management. Like, what about all those different personalities you have to deal with in the workplace? What does Grove have to say about managing different styles and, maybe even some of the more challenging personalities?
So Grove, he acknowledges right off the bat that there's no one right way to manage. Like, managers, they fall on a spectrum. Some are super hands-on, like they're involved in every little detail, while others are more, hands-off. They kind of give their team space to do their thing.
Right. And I'm guessing there are pros and cons to both approaches.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And Grove doesn't really say that one is better than the other, but he does stress that no matter what your management style is, you have to address problematic behavior directly. Like, you can't just let things fester and hope they'll magically resolve themselves.
Yeah, because ignoring a problem usually just makes it worse.
Exactly. And he gives this example of an employee who's constantly late, like chronically late.
Oh, I've worked with people like that. It can be so frustrating.
Totally. But Grove points out that, sometimes there's a deeper reason behind the behavior, like maybe this employee is struggling with childcare or something like that. So he recommends having a conversation with the employee, but in a compassionate way. Like, you're not attacking them, you're just pointing out the impact their lateness has on the team and asking them to, try to find a solution.
It's about addressing the behavior, but also acknowledging that people are complex. There might be stuff going on that we don't know about. Now, what about those situations where someone gets put in charge, but they don't actually have any formal authority? Like, they're the acting supervisor, but they don't really have the power to, hire or fire or anything like that.
Right. That can be a tough spot to be in. But Grove, he actually sees those situations as a really good way to learn.
Okay, how so?
Because when you have to manage people without any real authority, you have to rely on other skills like persuasion,
Yeah.
You have to learn how to motivate people and get them to buy into what you're saying, even if you can't just, tell them what to do.
So it's like a crash course in influence and, building relationships.
Exactly. And those skills, they're valuable even when you do have formal authority, because ultimately you can't just boss people around all the time. You need to be able to get them on your side.
Absolutely. Okay, he also mentions a situation that I think a lot of people have probably experienced. It's where you've got like a senior secretary or someone in that kind of role who ends up taking on a lot of like de facto management responsibilities, even though, it's not technically their job.
Yeah, that can be tricky.
Because on the one hand, they've often been there forever. They know how everything works and they're, trying to keep things running smoothly.
Right. But on the other hand, it can create a lot of tension if they start, acting like they have more authority than they actually do.
Exactly. Like Groves gives an example of a senior secretary who was monitoring everyone's break times. And on the surface, it's like, okay, she's just trying to make sure people aren't taking advantage. But if she doesn't have the authority to do that, it can come across as overstepping or even power tripping.
Right, right. And that can totally undermine morale. So in those situations, Grove says it's really important to have really clear communication and well-defined roles. Like everyone needs to understand who's responsible for what and what the limits of their authority are.
That makes sense. And it probably helps to have, some kind of formal acknowledgement of the value that those senior staff members bring.
Yeah.
Because, they often do play a really important role in keeping things running smoothly.
Yeah, definitely. It's all about finding that balance between respecting their experience and knowledge and also, making sure everyone understands the official lines of authority.
Okay, so switching gears a bit, let's talk about something that I think can really poison a workplace. Hypocrisy from a boss. Like when they say one thing and then do the exact opposite. Grove has some pretty strong feelings about this, doesn't he?
Oh, yeah, he does. He sees hypocrisy in a boss as, incredibly damaging to the people who work for them.
Why is that?
Well, first of all, it creates a lot of stress and anxiety for the employees. They don't know what to believe or who to trust. And it also undermines trust in the manager, obviously. But what Grove really emphasizes is that it can actually, warp your own sense of ethics if you're exposed to it for too long.
That's interesting. So it's not just about, feeling annoyed or frustrated. It's about the potential for it to actually, change how you view right and wrong.
Exactly. If your boss is constantly cutting corners or bending the rules, it can start to feel like that's just, how things are done. And that can be really dangerous, both for you personally and for the organization as a whole.
Okay, so let's say you're in that situation.
Well,
What does Grove recommend?
he's pretty straightforward about it. He says you have two options. Either confront the hypocrisy head on or get out.
Wow. Okay, so no middle ground.
Not really. He's basically saying that staying in that kind of environment is just too toxic. If you can't have an honest conversation with your boss about the discrepancy between their words and their actions, then it's time to start looking for a new job.
It's about protecting yourself, basically.
Exactly. You have to protect yourself and you have to protect your own sense of ethics. Because working for a hypocrite, it can seriously mess with your head.
Okay, so let's say you're a manager and you got a team to manage. What about those difficult employees that we all encounter at some point? Like Grove talks about different types, like the judgmental employee. How do you handle that?
Yeah, the judgmental one. So Grove, he starts by asking a really tough question. Is this person actually worth the trouble they're causing?
Ouch. Okay. So it's not about trying to fix them or anything like that. It's about deciding if their negative impact outweighs their positive contributions.
Exactly. If they're a top performer and they're bringing in a ton of value, but they're also, constantly criticizing their colleagues, you might decide that it's worth trying to manage that behavior. But if their negativity is constantly dragging the team down, then Grove says you might need to have a conversation about whether this is really the right environment for them.
And that conversation probably won't be easy.
No, not at all. But it's important because, like we were talking about earlier, a manager's job is to create a positive and productive work environment for everyone. And if one person is constantly bringing everyone down, it's just not fair to the rest of the team.
Okay, so that's the judgmental employee. What about the one who just has a million excuses? Like they never meet a deadline without some elaborate explanation for why it's not their fault.
Ah, yes, the excuse maker. Grove's solution for this one is what he calls management by objectives.
Management by objectives. Okay, what does that mean?
It basically means shifting the focus away from, subjective judgments and explanations, and instead focusing on concrete, measurable goals.
So instead of saying, hey, you were supposed to finish this report by Friday, why isn't it done? You say something like, here are the specific objectives for this project, and here are the deadlines for each one.
Exactly. And you set those objectives and deadlines in advance, so there's no room for, last-minute excuses.
That's smart. It takes away that, gray area where people can kind of weasel out of things.
Exactly. It's all about being clear and specific about expectations from the get-go.
Okay, now for the conversation that I think every manager dreads, the I'm thinking of quitting conversation.
Oof. Yeah, that one's never fun.
But it's also a real opportunity, right? If someone's thinking of leaving, it means something's not working for them. So how does Grove recommend handling those conversations.
He emphasizes the importance of listening, like really listening to understand what's driving the employee's decision to leave. Don't just jump in and try to, talk them out of it or offer them a raise or whatever.
Yeah, because sometimes it's not about the money, right?
Yeah, exactly. It might be about feeling undervalued or lacking opportunities for growth, or maybe they just don't like the company culture. So Grove says, ask open-ended questions. Try to get to the root of what's making them unhappy.
And maybe, just maybe, you can actually address those issues and convince them to stay.
Right. And even if they do end up leaving, you've at least gained valuable insight into what you might need to change to improve retention in the future.
Now, this is a bit of a heavier topic, but I think it's important to talk about what happens after a union vote, because those can be really divisive events and they can leave a lot of bad blood. What does Grove say about how managers can help rebuild things after something like that?
Yeah, union votes, they can be pretty brutal on team dynamics. And Grove, he's pretty clear about it. He says the manager's absolute top priority in the aftermath of a union vote is to rebuild trust and collaboration.
That sounds like a tall order, especially if things got really heated during the campaign.
It definitely is. But Grove emphasizes that it's essential. And he specifically says that you have to avoid any kind of retaliation against employees who supported the union.
Yeah, because that would just make things 1,000 times worse.
Exactly. And more importantly, he says you have to understand why people felt the need for a union in the first place. Like, what were the underlying concerns that led them to support unionization?
And that means actually listening to people, right? Like really hearing them out, even if you disagree with their perspective.
Exactly. It's about creating a space for dialogue and understanding, even if it's uncomfortable.
Okay, let's talk about something a little less, I guess, politically charged. Friendships in the workplace.
Ah, yes. The age-old question of whether you should be friends with your coworkers.
Right, and there are so many different opinions on this. Some people say you should only socialize with people at your same level, so you avoid any potential conflicts of interest.
And then there are those who say, nope, keep work and personal life completely separate. Like, don't even think about being friends with your colleagues.
Exactly. So where does Grove fall on this spectrum?
He actually believes that friendships and professional relationships can coexist successfully.
Okay, but that sounds tricky.
It can be, but Grove's point is that, you should choose your friends based on who you genuinely connect with, not based on their job title. But, and this is a big but, you also have to commit to upholding your professional responsibilities, no matter what.
So like if your friend messes up at work, you still have to hold them accountable, even if it's awkward.
Exactly. You can't let your personal feelings interfere with your professional judgment. And Grove also talks about the importance of your mindset. Like, if you go into it believing that it's possible to be friends with your colleagues without compromising your work, then you're much more likely to make it work.
It's about setting those boundaries and being really clear about them, both with yourself and with your friends.
Exactly. Now, working with relatives, that's a whole other can of worms.
Oh, for sure. It's like one of those things that sounds funny in theory, but in reality, yikes.
Yeah. Big yikes. And Grove is very clear about this. He says you have to keep professional and family relationships completely separate at work.
Which makes sense because it's hard to be objective when you're evaluating, your brother-in-law's performance or whatever.
Totally. And that's why most companies have policies against, direct supervision between family members, because it just creates too many opportunities for conflict of interest and, accusations of favoritism.
Okay, so we've talked about friends and family. Now, what about a situation where, say, you're a senior employee in a family business and you have to have that really difficult conversation with the owners about their son's performance?
Oh, man, that's a tough one.
Because on the one hand, it's like, hey, it's your business, do what you want. But on the other hand, if the son is, really messing things up, it affects everyone.
Right. And in that situation, Grove says that a long-time dedicated employee, they often have a responsibility to speak up.
Even though it could be really risky.
Yeah, even though it could be risky. But it's about doing what's best for the company and even for the owners themselves.
Okay, so how do you actually have that conversation?
Grove suggests approaching it with specific, documented evidence of the son's poor performance and framing it in a way that, encourages the owners to take action. Like maybe focus on the fact that, the son is probably going to inherit the business one day, so it's important that he's prepared to actually run it.
It's about appealing to their sense of, I guess, responsibility, both for the business and for their son's future.
Exactly. And it's about being honest, but also respectful.
Now, before we move on from this section on, workplace relationships and dynamics, I wanted to touch on something that Grove specifically addresses, the challenges that women often face in getting their voices heard and their contributions recognized. What advice does he give?
He talks about the importance of being assertive, but in a professional way. Like if you're in a meeting and your idea gets ignored, or worse, someone else takes credit for it.
Yeah, that's the worst.
He says you have to address it right then and there. Don't let it slide.
Even if it means, calling someone out in front of everyone.
Yeah, even if it means that. Because it sends a message that you're not going to be ignored and that you expect to be treated with respect. And he also emphasizes the importance of documenting your work so you have evidence to back up your claims if you need it.
It's about standing up for yourself, but also, being smart about it.
Exactly. It's about knowing your worth and making sure everyone else knows it too.
Okay, let's switch gears again and talk about feedback. And not just giving feedback, but also, admitting when you've messed up.
Right.
Grove is a big advocate for owning your mistakes, even if you're the boss. Why is that so important to him?
He sees it as a sign of strength, not weakness. Like, when you're willing to admit you're wrong, it shows that you're humble, that you're open to learning, and that you're not afraid to be vulnerable.
And that can be really powerful for a team, right? Because it sets the tone that it's okay to make mistakes, as long as you learn from them.
Exactly. It creates a culture of trust and psychological safety. People are more likely to take risks and innovate if they know that it's okay to fail sometimes. And Grove, he actually goes even further. He says that younger managers, especially those who are managing people who are older than them, they should actually go out of their way to admit their mistakes.
That's interesting. Why does he say that?
Because he thinks it helps build respect. Like, it shows that you're not trying to pretend you're perfect and that you're willing to be open and honest with your team.
Okay, so admitting your own mistakes is important.
Yeah.
But what about giving feedback to others? Like performance reviews, for example. Those can be really tricky. What's Grove's philosophy on those?
He believes that the main purpose of a performance review is to help the employee grow and improve. Like, it's not about, punishing them for their mistakes or anything like that. It's about identifying their strengths and weaknesses and helping them develop their skills.
So it's more like a coaching session than a judgment.
Exactly. And he tells this story about a performance review that was just like overwhelmingly positive. Like, the manager just gushed about how great the employee was, but they didn't give them any real feedback on how they could improve.
Ouch. I could see how that would be almost worse than getting negative feedback.
Yeah.
Because it's like, are they just being nice? Do they actually see my potential?
Right. And Grove's point is that, people need that constructive criticism to actually grow. Like, if you're just constantly telling them how great they are, they're never going to get any better.
And he's also a big believer in putting those reviews in writing, even though it takes more time.
Yeah, he is. Because it forces you to be clear and specific in your feedback, and it also provides a record of the conversation, so there's no confusion later on.
Right. And it can be helpful for the employee, too, because they can go back and refer to it later if they need to. Okay, so we've talked about giving feedback. Now, what about when someone leaves the company, especially if it's, not on the best terms? How do you handle that with the rest of the team? Like, how much do you tell them?
Grove says that you need to balance transparency with confidentiality. Like, you want to be open with your team about, the kinds of things that can lead to termination so they can learn from those mistakes. But you also have to respect the privacy of the person who left.
So it's okay to say, hey, repeatedly missing deadlines can lead to disciplinary action, but you don't name names.
Exactly. You keep the specifics confidential, but you still communicate those general principles to the team.
That makes sense. Okay, let's move on to decision-making. It can be so frustrating as a manager when you make a decision and then your team just, resists it or even undermines it. Why does Grove think this happens?
He often attributes it to a lack of common courtesy. Like, you made a decision without considering their input or explaining your reasoning. And that can make people feel like, they're not being respected or that their opinions don't matter.
Right. So it's not just about the decision itself. It's about how you communicate it.
Exactly. Grove tells this story about this college student who was leading a committee, right? And he came up with this proposal that he thought was great, but his faculty advisor just, shot it down immediately.
Ouch.
Yeah. And the student was really upset, not just because his idea was rejected, but because he felt like his advisor hadn't even bothered to listen to him. So the takeaway for managers is that whenever possible, you should involve your team in the decision-making process.
So even if you already know what decision you're going to make, you still take the time to hear people out.
Exactly, because it shows that you value their input, even if you don't end up going with their suggestion. And when people feel like they've been heard, they're much more likely to support the decision, even if it wasn't their first choice.
It's about building buy-in, basically.
Exactly.
Now, Grove makes a distinction between a dictatorial manager and a decisive leader. What's the difference?
Well, a dictatorial manager, they just make decisions without consulting anyone, and they expect everyone to just fall in line. A decisive leader, on the other hand, they're still the ones making the final call, but they do it after, considering all the angles and getting input from their team.
So it's not about being afraid to make decisions. It's about knowing when to be decisive and when to be collaborative.
Exactly. And Grove says that timing is key. Like, a decisive leader knows when to shut down discussion and just make the call. Because if you let things drag on forever, you can actually end up being less effective.
And of course, there are those situations where you just have to act quickly, right? Like if there's an emergency or something.
Right, but those should be the exception, not the rule. And Grove specifically advises new managers to, take some time to really understand the existing environment before they start making a bunch of changes.
So it's like, don't just assume that what worked in your last job is going to work here.
Exactly. Take the time to learn how things are done, why they're done that way, and what the potential consequences of changing things might be.
Okay, now let's talk about something that I think a lot of people struggle with. Communicating bad news. Whether it's, layoffs, budget cuts, or just, some bad news about a project. How does Grove say we should handle those conversations?
He's a big believer in honesty and directness. Like, don't sugarcoat things or try to hide the truth.
Because people will see right through that, right?
Exactly. And it'll just make them more distrustful. So even if it's uncomfortable, just be straight with people. Tell them what's going on, why it's happening, and what it means for them.
And what about when you're dealing with, like, negative press or public scrutiny?
Grove's advice is to be as accessible as possible. Like, don't try to hide from the media or ignore the problem. Instead, use the opportunity to present your side of the story and be transparent about what you're doing to address the situation.
So it's about controlling the narrative as much as you can.
Exactly. You might not be able to completely control what people are saying, but you can at least try to influence the conversation.
Okay, let's shift gears again and talk about time management and productivity. Because, we all only have so many hours in the day.
Yeah.
So what does Grove say about how we can use our time more effectively?
He talks about two main strategies: selectivity and regularity.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
So selectivity means being really intentional about what you choose to do, and just as importantly, what you choose not to do.
So it's about prioritizing, basically. Figuring out what's truly important and focusing on that.
Exactly. And then regularity means introducing more structure into your day, like grouping similar tasks together so you're not constantly switching back and forth between different things.
Right, because all that context switching, it just kills your focus.
Totally. And he also talks about the importance of managing interruptions.
Yeah, that's a big one. Like the open door policy, it sounds good in theory, but it can be a real productivity killer in practice.
Right. So Grove suggests channeling those open door interactions into more structured times. Like maybe you have specific hours set aside for meeting with people so you're not constantly being interrupted throughout the day.
That makes sense. It's about finding that balance between being accessible and also protecting your time.
Exactly. And he also talks about how a good secretary can be a huge help with time management.